So without further ado, it's a real pleasure. This is the first in a series of interviews that I'm going to be doing during this quarantine time with wonderful musicians. And I'm so grateful and, honored that you've agreed to do this. And you're the very first one opening the series of interviews. So Corine Brouwer, concertmaster experience with the Winston-Salem Symphony, among other organizations. So thank you very much for joining me and welcome. And tell me a little bit more about these positions and what you've been doing in the last few years.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for inviting me. And it's good to see you again virtually.
Definitely.
So besides concertmaster with the Winston-Salem Symphony, I have functioned in that role with a number of different organizations, some of which are still functioning, some are not. And so also I play with a number of music festivals. I have the Eastern Music Festival, which is nearby in the summer with Gerard Schwartz, and that runs in June and July. And then I'm very happy to be with the Sun River Music Festival in Sun River, Oregon during the month of August. And in addition, I do perform with the Arizona MusicFest, which is in Scottsdale, Arizona in February. And I feel very lucky to have the opportunity to go to Oregon during August because North Carolina does get a little steamy. And then to go to Arizona in February to see sunshine does not hurt my feelings at all. But they're all wonderful organizations, and I feel very privileged to have the opportunity to perform with all of them.
Wonderful. So you escape the weather when you can, which is very wise. And it's really nice to see also how you're sharing your talents in different sides of the US. So going back and just to get our feet wet here, to get started on this, part of the interview, how do you organize your time during quarantine? These are very unusual times. This is unprecedented for us musicians and for so many arts organizations that are struggling. So how does one stay focused? What would be your advice to young musicians? What do you do? How do you organize your time? How do you find the motivation to practice and get ready for something that might not be happening and might be canceled?
Well, that's an interesting question to me right now because I have had a personal project that's kind of overtaken my life at this time out of necessity. I've been renovating the house I'm sitting in for about a year now. And when I saw what was happening with the virus, I had to put my attentions on getting into the house so that I could stop paying rent and storage fees elsewhere. So for me, that's been kind of a focal point, and I'm just now opening up to the point where I can address the very issues you're bringing up here. I think that if you love music and if you're a performer, this is one of those opportune times, if we choose to view it through those lenses, of having the time to dig into that Bach sonata that we've always been wishing we had the time to delve deeply, or to up our technique in certain areas, and to figure out, actually, as effective and efficient a practice routine that we can come up with, because when life is busy again, we need that. And that's always a challenge as a professional musician. You get to a certain point of busyness and practice time is at a premium. So to learn how to be very efficient about that and effective and to keep up certain skill sets is a great use of this time. This is like going back to being in junior high and high school when you're practicing for the sheer love of it. And it's good to revisit that. And it's unusual to have the opportunity to do so. If you don't like playing now, it may be something that you should look at. Why? Because this is playing for the pure joy of playing.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, it's good to go back to the origins, the original feelings of motivation, right?
Exactly.
All right, so the next question I have is with regards to your role as concertmaster and with specific regards to Bowings, and how do you like doing this? Have you tried different systems over the years? How do you collaborate with other principals if you do for this? Do you sometimes have to negotiate bowings with a conductor? If a guest conductor comes with their own set of bowings, sometimes it might be to your liking, sometimes not. So a little bit of you know, your input on this would be nice.
Certainly. So I've tried all sorts of different approaches to bowings. The ideal is something that I can afford to do right now, is to have the time to really dig deep into the piece and listen to many recordings and decide exactly what phrasing I adore and would love to hear my section do and how best to accomplish that. To have a score next to me so I can see how it affects all of the other sections. There's the ideal, and then there's the real. Again, so often bowings come across your desk not at an opportune time. You may be very, very busy. And so you figure out for each individual concertmaster, you figure out your ways of doing the very best bowings possible, sometimes on a budgeted time allowance. If a guest conductor comes in and feels strongly enough and has a set of bowings, unless I have something that I feel rather strongly about, I try to honor that. They've put in the time to do that. So I'm very flexible with that. We have a new music director in Winston Symphony, so we're learning his styles and his preferences for different periods. So this has been a bit of a learning process. And early on, we try to get together as the group of principal string players to play through something with the conductor there, especially on pieces that are more stylistically demanding, say Mozart or possibly Beethoven. There are many ways to interpret those, depending on how far somebody does or doesn't go into early music practices, can affect what they want to hear. So once you've worked with a music director for a while and know their preferences, some of it becomes a little easier to accomplish. Normally the way our orchestra handles bowings is that I'm given my part to bow, it's distributed to the other principals. If it turns out something that I've done doesn't coordinate with their parts very well, I'm very open to having them come back to me and say, hey, we have a problem here. Is there another solution? And again, would love to always have a score, but arts organizations are on a budget. And so sometimes there aren't scores available. And so that's how we disseminate it through our organization on a regular basis.
Wonderful. So the next question is somewhat combined, and it has to do with the power dynamics within an orchestra, something that would be helpful to know for young musicians, and how does the concertmaster relate to the principal oboe, the principal second violin, etc. How do you see this?
Well, there are the traditional hierarchies, but I think the more collaborative you can be, the better the working dynamic in the group. And so unless there are personality clashes or someone's going through some difficulties, it's best to try just to work together to find the best solutions and not to take a strong stance on, any kind of edict from above. And for most orchestras that I've played in and most organizations, that's definitely possible to do. It needs to be done with mutual respect. And if we all keep in mind that we want to do the best artistic performance, that's very helpful to keep everyone focused on the same goal.
Wonderful. And then this next question is somewhat related to the previous one, because it's your relationship to conductors. And over the years, I'm sure you've had wonderful experiences and not so good ones. And you don't need, I'm not going to ask you to name any names, but, if you want to tell us about different examples of when something really clicks and works wonderfully, and sometimes when it might not.
Sure. Well, my favorite dynamic is when I'm working with someone who's very intuitive. I've had the ability to do this from time to time, where I can you try to be subtle about it, but you do something slightly different than they're asking, rather than having to go, "Maestro, have you thought about?" You know, just by doing something, and when they're very aware, it becomes, "Oh, okay." And this can be a nonverbal communication in the very best.
And it makes life a lot easier, I'm sure.
Yes. In the very best circumstances, this is what you hope for. Now, that can take time to develop. And both people have to be very secure to be able to give and take on that and to understand that dynamic. Sometimes you have to talk about it off the podium. I do think for any young concertmaster, the very important aspect is, if you disagree with the conductor, try always to find times off the podium to discuss those things, because you don't want them calling you down in rehearsal, and vice versa. They're not going to appreciate it either. It's just a human nature thing. So try and find at break or before or after rehearsal to be able to speak with them and say, "Hey, you know, I know you're asking for this, but," or "Have you thought about this option?" Or, you know, to have that respect for each other, to be each other's supporters in the dynamic of the orchestra rehearsals, but to have the freedom to speak freely off the podium or out of the concertmaster chair to work on those things is a really important relationship to build. There are many conductors who understand this and do this. There are some conductors who do not. And so, you know, in the end, you can do what you can do, and you try to make the most positive situation occur with whatever cards are on the table at the time.
Wonderful, wonderful. Now, to change the topic a little bit, tell us about your experience playing a concerto with the orchestra, whether in the same orchestra that you're a concertmaster, or with another one.
Sure. Well, my first concerto experience actually was a project that I undertook to commission a new work. And I was able to form a consortium of 5 different orchestras. The composer was a wonderful woman, Hilary Tann, and the piece is called Here, the Cliffs, and Here is H-E-R-E, not here. It's a little bit of a difficult title. We received national grant funding largely because we had 8 performances ready to roll when we put the grant in, which was unusual for a new piece. And I had played with North Carolina Symphony in the past, and I knew the conductor there, and so they were very gracious to allow the premiere to be with North Carolina Symphony. So the first time I stepped on stage to solo was with a major orchestra. That was a little disconcerting, not gonna lie to you. That was a big gulp. And it was fraught with other things going on in the background that were personal and music related, as these projects always tend to be. I would say to any young artist, if you're taking on a big project, it's almost Murphy's Law that you're going to have challenging things going on all around you when you do it. Just expect it and roll with it, because it's how it goes. So the biggest difference, it's very hard to switch from soloist to concertmaster because the kind of sound production required and the kind of presence required is so different as soloist than concertmaster. Now, when you're playing concertmaster, you have to have a bit of this because you go from being in the section to suddenly soloist. So it's a little schizophrenic having to do it, but it's on a short-term basis. Concerto, it's all you. So learning how to hear yourself amidst this massive, wonderful, amazing, magical wall of sound that's behind you, and what to listen for, and how your part correlates with the orchestra part. And it's usually you don't have a generous amount of rehearsal time. Typically, when you come in as soloist, you're running it through once with the orchestra, dress rehearsal, show or shows. So it's very quick. And when you're premiering a new piece, it has the added dynamic of that first rehearsal is the first time you've ever really heard the piece with the orchestra. When I did this with North Carolina Symphony, they were very generous and gave me 2 rehearsals prior to the dress to help, but that's not always going to be the case. So that was a little more of a challenge than when I went back to do more standard concertos.
Definitely. Okay, so that's actually very, very helpful, and to know, in terms of presence, sound production, you made some really, really interesting points. So the next thing I want to ask you to share is about your practice routine. Any tips that you might have for younger musicians to practice sight reading, or how to organize yourself? Sometimes you're working on a piece and there is this one section that is the challenging one. How do you approach those things?
Well, I will say that if you are fortunate enough to be in a major orchestra where your schedule is a little more set and reliable, that's a huge advantage. You will have more time to put in. It's kind of the, conundrum of, until you're in that situation, you're fighting for time, because a freelancer's time is very busy. What's helpful is to sit down at the beginning of the season and scan ahead to what you are scheduled to be playing, to try and pull the pieces that are going to be the most challenging, to try and find the excerpts within those pieces which are the most challenging. Some of them you may not if they're new to you. And if you're young and going through the repertoire for the first time, then that's also a process. To try and be organized about getting ahead of that is very important. And I think any honest freelancer will tell you that there are times when we are more or less successful with that, just based on the demands of the life we lead. So the earlier you can get on top of a very exposed passage, a very difficult passage, and just work it almost like an etude into your warm-up, that you do your scales, arpeggios, however you're designing your warm-ups, and then going into what would be the etude section. Often as an orchestral player, pulling the excerpts from what's coming up 3 months ahead as your etude work can be really helpful. And then you have to turn your attention to whatever the upcoming performances are to make sure that they're ready as they can be.
Wonderful. So you've touched on this with relationship to the concerto, which you've commissioned, but I wanted to ask you what your experience has been with regards to new music, whether as a soloist or performing within the symphony orchestra, and in general, programming, what you've seen that works or what you've seen that doesn't work with regards to programming. There is so much that can be done, and there is really no one size fits all. So I'm interested in, in your particular experience, what you've seen and what your take is.
Well, I think that depending on your community and the artistic culture that's been developed within that community, new works must be given serious consideration to present them in such a way that people accept, understand, and are excited to hear a new work. Some people are daunted by it. They've been exposed to new works that they really did not like. If you have a music director who's good at choosing those things and makes them interesting and exciting, that's great. But if there's been history of a music director that's made not so good choices for the community, then you have a challenging spot there, and you sometimes get pushback from symphony boards because they're looking at wanting to make sure programs pull people in. As to what works with programming, that's like having a magic 8-ball. So, I wish that I could give you some sage words of wisdom for that, but trying to find a nice arc to the season for an orchestra, for instance, that there are things throughout the season kind of for everyone, but still that makes some kind of artistic sense, both within the individual programs, but also maybe over the scope of the season. And what that is different for every community. It's different for every orchestra. Trying to play to the strengths of the orchestra, trying to play to what you know are the preferences of your community, but inserting little challenge things of, I know you love this, but give this a listen, you know, to try and do that in a way that is intriguing, I think is one of the most important aspects. Marketing has to be truthful. If you market and it's not truthful and somebody comes to the concert and feels like they were misled in some way, it's not going to help. So
I think you're hinting to one of the words that I like the most in you know, with regards to programming, which is trust, building trust.
yes.
If you market something for one thing and you give the audience something else, you're losing their trust.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. What we do has to have a very strong integrity about it in order to have, well, the trust of the audience, the trust of the composers who might write for us, the trust of the musicians. Yeah, and that's a very important element in the arts. When the integrity is high, things always work better. The arts are challenging. We all know that. So we have to be as truthful to our art form and to our goals as we can be.
All right, so we're approaching the last question, and it is somewhat related. As you see, there is this arc somehow coming into the conversation. So what would you change in the world of symphony orchestras today in the US? And somewhat this is related to, you know, how to make what we do more accessible, more widely available to the audience.
You know, I've been thinking about that during my unpacking. And what comes to mind is I took a sabbatical a few years ago in 2016, and I lived in Cusco, Peru for 6 months. And I went for a variety of reasons. But I was delighted to find out that there was actually an orchestra in Cusco. It was a young orchestra, and it was funded by the city. So the concerts were free to the public. And it was a really beautiful thing. There were challenges because, okay, so Cusco, Peru is equatorial, but it's also at 11,000 feet.
Right.
And none of the buildings have heat. So the orchestra plays on an unheated stage and the audience sits in their winter coats and their scarves and their hats. Makes for challenging intonation for the instruments, obviously. But I never went to a concert at their main hall where it wasn't packed. And it was grandparents and parents bringing their children. And it was very much a family affair. And it was just part of what they did. And the opportunity to hear a symphony orchestra live was viewed as a great opportunity for their children, and an amazing benefit of living in Cusco. It's such a tricky thing with the funding for the arts. I think part of what needs to happen and part of what we need to champion as artists is really talking about the intrinsic value of beauty in our life. That it's not talked about very much in school. It's not talked about very much in the culture. It is interesting to me, as we're all quarantined, everybody's turning to the arts to fill their days and their time, whether it's reading a book or watching a movie or listening to music, or these are all the things that we choose to participate in when life is stripped down to its barest. This should really tell us something about how important the arts are to life, to culture, to education, and to the meaning of who we are as human beings, who we are as a community. And I think that symphony orchestras, by their collectiveness, you cannot have a symphony orchestra without a community. The whole process of playing in an orchestra is communal. And we have a community. And I think that talking about this straightforwardly and bringing it to people's awareness, especially following when we come out of this, is a grand opportunity to bring home how important the arts are to our quality of life, how important beauty is, and how important live music is. While we're enjoying it via, our technological outlets, we all know it's not the same as being there live. Just like it's wonderful to talk to you this way, but it's not the same as being in the same room, in the same space.
Definitely.
So I hope that when we come out of this, there's a new, renewed, greater appreciation for the art forms that we all know and love so well.
Corine, thank you so very much. It's been wonderful to hear your wise words about all these topics, and I really appreciate the time and all the thought you've given into this.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for asking me. I'm very honored, and look forward to the next time we speak.
Definitely. Thanks again.
Take care.